They called her Ash Hand, a name born of lye soap and frozen water. Elara knew no other. It was etched into her skin like the grime under her nails, a constant, gritty reminder of her place. She was nothing, an orphan, an omega, a shadow that scrubbed the great hall's flagstones while the pack feasted. The cold of the stone seeped through the thin wool of her breeches, a familiar ache that lived deep in her bones. It was a cold that never truly left. She scrubbed, her shoulders burning with the effort. Her hands were raw, split and bleeding in a dozen places, but she ignored the sting. Pain was a companion, as constant as the hunger in her belly. She focused on the rhythm. Dip the brush in the bucket of icy water, scrub the stone, wipe with a rag. Dip, scrub, wipe. The motion was a prayer to be invisible, a plea to go unnoticed. But invisibility was a luxury she was rarely afforded.
Look at it, slaving away like a good little stray.
The voice was sharp and cruel, a sound that made Elara's spine tighten instinctively. Lyra, Alpha Volkov's daughter, beautiful and venomous, stood over her with two of her friends, their fine leather boots threatening to step on Elara's sore fingers. Elara kept her head down, her world shrinking to the gray stone in front of her. Do not look up, do not speak, do not exist. A booted foot nudged her bucket, sloshing freezing, dirty water over her legs. The shock of it was a gasp of pain against her skin. "Did you not hear me, Ash Hand?" Lyra's voice dripped with condescending sweetness. "I said, look at you." Slowly, Elara lifted her head. To disobey was to invite a worse punishment. Lyra's eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a familiar, gleeful malice. She was a vision in dark furs and embroidered wool, her blonde hair a perfect, intricate braid. Beside her, Elara knew she must look like a smudge of dirt, all sharp angles and faded gray. "Pathetic," Lyra sneered, the word a physical blow. "Still scrubbing the floors my father allows you to sleep on. You should be grateful we did not cast you out into the snow when your useless parents died." The mention of her parents was a fresh wound, a blade twisted in a place that never healed. Elara bit down on her lip, tasting blood. She would not cry. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction. She had learned long ago that her tears were a currency Lyra loved to spend. She held the silence, a fragile shield against the verbal onslaught. It was a small act of defiance, the only one she had. Inside, a tiny, stubborn ember of something refused to be extinguished. It was a quiet, desperate thing that whispered, "You are more than this." But its voice was so faint, drowned out by the years of abuse and the gnawing worthlessness that clung to her like a shroud. Lyra, bored with the lack of reaction, kicked the bucket over completely. The rest of the frigid water cascaded across the floor, soaking Elara to the bone. "Clean that up," she commanded with a flick of her wrist. "And fetch more firewood for the upper hearth. The blizzard is getting worse, and I refuse to be cold." Her friends giggled. The sound was like breaking glass. Elara watched them walk away, their laughter echoing in the vast, empty hall. A tremor started in her hands, a mixture of cold and suppressed rage. Fetch firewood. In this storm. It was not a request. It was a death sentence disguised as a chore. The wind was already howling outside, a hungry beast clawing at the thick stone walls of the pack house. No one went out in a storm like this unless they had to. But she was an omega. She was Ash Hand. She had to. Gritting her teeth against the chattering of her own jaw, Elara pushed herself to her feet. Her sodden clothes clung to her, stealing what little warmth she had. Every muscle screamed in protest. She pushed forward anyway. That small, stubborn ember inside her burned a little brighter. She would not break. Not today. The blizzard was a living entity, a screaming white monster of wind and ice. The moment Elara stepped outside, it swallowed her whole. The wind sliced like claws, stealing the breath from her lungs and plastering her thin tunic to her skin. Snow, sharp and blinding, filled the air, erasing the world. The woodpile, usually a short walk from the kitchens, was a world away. She pulled her threadbare cloak tighter, a useless gesture. The cold was absolute, a physical force that sought to grind her down. Each step was a battle. The snow was already deep, drifting up past her knees, and she stumbled through it, her legs numb and clumsy. Why? The question screamed in her mind. Why did they hate her so much? What had she ever done but try to survive? She was an anomaly, a wolf shifter who could not shift. Her parents had been the same, a line of weakness in a pack that valued strength above all else. When they died in a border skirmish years ago, she had been left a burden, a constant, shameful reminder of their pack's flawed bloodline. She was tolerated, not accepted, a tool to be used and discarded. Her arms were full of logs, the rough bark scraping her frozen skin, when the ground beneath her simply vanished. One moment she was fighting her way back towards the faint, distant light of the pack house. The next, she was falling. A cry was ripped from her throat, swallowed by the storm's roar. She tumbled down a steep, snow-covered ravine, logs scattering around her. Pain erupted in her side as she slammed against something hard, and then darkness claimed her. When consciousness returned, it did so in pieces. First came the cold, a deep, penetrating chill that felt like death itself. Then came the pain, a sharp, insistent throbbing in her ribs. She was lying in the snow, curled in on herself at the bottom of the ravine. The world above was a churning vortex of white. There was no way back up. The storm had hidden her, buried her. They would not look for her. They would assume the blizzard had taken her, and they would be glad. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat. She was going to die here. Alone, forgotten. The thought was a hollow ache in her chest. Then she saw it. A faint, dark opening in the rock face, partially obscured by a curtain of snow-dusted pines. A cave. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar thing, flickered to life. With a groan, she forced herself to move. Every inch was agony. She crawled, dragging her injured body through the deepening snow, her fingers numb and clumsy. The entrance to the cave was a promise of shelter, a sliver of a chance. Inside, the air was still and blessedly free of the wind's assault. It was dark, the only light a faint gray filtering in from the entrance. The scent of damp earth, pine, and something else filled her nostrils. Something metallic and warm. Blood. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, and she saw him. He was a giant, a figure of impossible scale slumped against the far wall of the cave. Even sitting, he was taller than she was standing. Broad shoulders were encased in dark, travel-worn leathers, and a great fur cloak was pooled around him. His hair, long and the color of a moonless night, was matted with snow and something darker. A massive wound marred his side, a ragged tear in his tunic from which blood flowed sluggishly, staining the stone floor beneath him. But it was his face that held her captive. It was a face carved from granite and fury, all harsh angles and predatory beauty. A conqueror's face, a king's. Even unconscious, he radiated an aura of power that was terrifying and absolute. It pressed in on her, a physical weight in the air that made her want to run, to hide, to make herself small. Who was he? No one from her pack, she was certain. She would have remembered a man like this. He was a stranger, a powerful one, wounded and alone in the heart of the storm. Her first instinct was fear. Her second, ingrained by years of servitude, was to help. He was hurt. He was bleeding. He would die if left alone. The thought of another soul perishing in this cold wasteland was more than she could bear. Hesitantly, she crept closer. His breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the silence of the cave. The wound in his side was deep, far worse than she had first thought. It needed to be cleaned, packed, bound. She had nothing. Nothing but her own tattered clothes and her raw, bleeding hands. It would have to be enough. She knelt beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was so close now she could feel the faint heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the deathly chill of her own. With trembling fingers, she took the hem of her worn tunic. The fabric was thin and old, but it was all she had. She ripped a long strip from the bottom. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she reached for him. The moment her fingers made contact with his skin, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A tidal wave of heat and light and raw power crashed through her, originating from the point of their touch. It was a wildfire racing up her arm, setting every nerve ablaze. A golden light erupted behind her eyes, blinding her. She felt more than saw a torrent of images, of ancient forests and silver moons, of roaring fires and epic battles, of a profound, soul-deep loneliness that stretched back for centuries. It was his life, his power, his pain, all pouring into her at once. She cried out, a sound of pure shock, and tried to pull away, but she was trapped. An invisible force held her fast. A burning agony seared itself onto her skin, just above her collarbone. It felt like a brand, a white-hot stamp of ownership being pressed into her very soul. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light faded. The torrent of feelings receded, leaving behind a humming, thrumming connection that vibrated between them. It was a cord, a living link that now tied her to this stranger. Shaking, breathless, she stared at her hand, still resting on his skin. Where the brand had burned her, a mark was now forming on her flesh. It was intricate and beautiful, a swirl of silver lines that depicted a wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl at a sun made of pure gold. A low groan rumbled from the man's chest. His eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a normal man. They were molten gold, glowing with an inner light, intelligent and ancient and utterly terrifying. They pinned her in place, seeing not just the ragged Omega girl, but straight through to the trembling core of her. His gaze was a physical weight, a claim. His voice, when it came, was a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very stones of the cave. It was rough with pain, but held an undeniable note of absolute authority. Mine. The word was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that changed the world. Ilara recoiled as if struck. Fear, primal and overwhelming, surged through her. This was wrong. This was impossible. What was happening? The mark on her skin pulsed with a faint warmth, a phantom echo of the searing pain from moments before. The connection between them was still there, a tangible thing she could feel in the space between their bodies. Her instincts, dormant and broken for so long, were screaming at her. One word, over and over. Mate. But her mind, conditioned by a lifetime of worthlessness, rebelled. Mate? Her? The pack's stray? The thought was so ludicrous it bordered on madness. A man like this, a creature of such immense power and presence, could not be hers. It was a mistake, a fever dream brought on by the cold and her injuries. No, she whispered, the word barely a puff of air. She scrambled backwards, away from him, her movements clumsy and panicked. The stone floor was rough against her hands. I don't know you. The Alpha King, for she could think of him as nothing less, watched her with an unnerving stillness. He tried to push himself up, a grimace of pain flashing across his harsh features before he settled back against the wall, his hand going to the bloody wound in his side. His golden eyes never left her. They held a dawning wonder, a fierce possessiveness, and something else, a deep, aching relief. You are her, he said, his voice softer now, laced with a disbelief that mirrored her own. After all this time, you are her. Her confusion warred with her terror. Her? Her who? She was Alara. She was Ashhand. She was nobody. "I was just trying to help," she stammered, holding up the torn strip of her tunic as if it were a shield. "You were bleeding." A faint smile, a bare curving of his lips, touched his mouth. It was a devastating sight, like the first ray of sunrise after a long, dark night. It did not soften the predatory danger in his face, but it added a layer of warmth that was somehow even more frightening. "And you branded yourself into my soul in the process," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the mark on her collarbone, which was now visible through the tear in her tunic. "The bond is forged." The bond. The word sent another tremor through her. Fated mates and soul bonds were the stuff of legends, of old tales told by the fire. They were for alphas, for powerful shifters, not for broken, shiftless omegas. What was he talking about? "I have to go," she said, her voice shaking. She needed to get away, to escape this impossible, terrifying man and the suffocating intensity of his gaze. She tried to get to her feet, but the pain in her side flared, sharp and blinding, and she collapsed back to the floor with a choked cry. In an instant, he moved. Despite his injury, he crossed the distance between them with a speed that was not human, closing the space before she could even draw a breath. He knelt before her, his massive frame blocking out the faint light from the cave entrance. He was a mountain of shadow and power, and she was trapped at his feet. "You are hurt," he stated, his voice now devoid of its earlier softness, replaced by a low, dangerous growl. His golden eyes scanned her, lingering on the place where she clutched her side. "Who did this to you?" The question was not one of idle curiosity. It was the query of a judge, of an executioner. The sheer menace in his tone made the air crackle. He was not asking what had happened. He was asking for a name to destroy. I fell," she whispered, shrinking away from him. His hand came up, and she flinched, expecting a blow. But his touch was impossibly gentle. His large, calloused fingers brushed a stray strand of matted hair from her face. The simple contact sent a jolt of warmth through her, a startling counterpoint to the fear. The bond between them flared, a silent hum of rightness, of belonging, that her mind refused to accept. "The fall injured your side," he said, his voice a low thrum of sound. "But the old bruises on your arms, the fear in your eyes, that is not from any fall. Who hurt you?" She could not answer. To speak against Lyra, against Alpha Volkov, was to sign her own death warrant. Her pack would tear her apart. He saw the terror in her eyes and seemed to understand. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The temperature in the cave dropped several degrees. "I am Kale," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern clans. And you," he added, his thumb stroking her cheek with that same unnerving gentleness, "are my mate. No one will ever hurt you again." Alpha King. The title slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. She had heard the whispers, of course. Every pack had. Tales of a supreme alpha who had united the warring northern territories, a shifter of ancient bloodline and unparalleled power. A ruthless, merciless leader who commanded legions. And he was here, in this cave, claiming her. It was too much. The pain, the cold, the shock of the bond, the terror of his identity, it all crashed down on her at once. The edges of her vision began to darken. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was the fierce, protective fire in his molten gold eyes. The last thing she felt was his strong arms catching her as she fell. She woke to warmth, not the fleeting, inadequate heat of a distant fire, but a deep, enveloping warmth that seemed to soak into her very bones. She was lying on a bed of thick, soft furs, and a heavy blanket was tucked around her. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth nearby, casting a warm, flickering glow across a room made of dark, polished wood and stone. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke and something else. Something that smelled like him, like Cale. Panic fluttered in her chest. She sat up, ignoring the protest of her bruised ribs. She was in a bedchamber, a vast and opulent one. Furs and woven tapestries covered the walls, and a large, intricately carved wardrobe stood against one wall. Where was she? The heavy wooden door opened, and a woman entered, carrying a tray. She was older, with kind eyes and hair the color of salt and pepper, tied back in a neat bun. She wore the simple, practical dress of a healer.
"Ah, you're awake," the woman said, her voice calm and soothing. "The king will be pleased. I am Ilara, the pack healer. How do you feel?" Ilara stared at her, her throat too dry to speak. The woman's name was the same as hers. The irony was not lost on her. Here was an Ilara who was respected, who had a purpose. The healer set the tray down on a nearby table. It held a bowl of steaming broth, a cup of water, and some bandages. "You have some cracked ribs and a great deal of bruising, but nothing is broken. You were lucky. The king carried you through the rest of the storm himself." The king. Cale. It had not been a dream. Where am I?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a rough whisper. "You are in the citadel, the heart of the northern clans," the healer replied gently. "You are safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign, alien. She had never been safe. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a simple linen nightdress, clean and soft against her skin. Someone had cleaned her up, had tended to her wounds, and beneath the high collar of the nightdress, she could feel the faint raised lines of the mark. The bond. It was still there, a low, constant hum at the edge of her senses, connecting her to him. As if summoned by the thought, the door opened again. Cale filled the doorway, his presence sucking all the air from the room. He had changed out of his blood-soaked leathers into a simple black tunic and breeches that did little to hide the sheer power of his physique. His wound had been bandaged, but he still moved with a slight stiffness. His dark hair was clean, pulled back from his face, and his golden eyes found hers instantly. The healer gave a respectful bow. "Your Majesty, she is awake." "Leave us," Cale commanded. His voice was soft, but it was not a request. The healer bowed again and departed, closing the door quietly behind her. They were alone. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Ilara pulled the blankets tighter around herself, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her sore ribs. He was even more intimidating now, clean and healed and standing in what was clearly his own domain. He was power incarnate, and he thought she belonged to him. He walked to the bed and sat on the edge. The mattress dipped under his weight. He did not touch her, but she could feel the heat of him, could feel the bond between them singing in the small space. "You are afraid," he stated. She swallowed hard and nodded, unable to find her voice. "You do not need to be," he said, his gaze intense. "I will not harm you." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I have waited for you for a very long time, little one. I had begun to believe you did not exist." "I don't understand," she whispered. "This bond, it's a mistake. I'm nothing. An omega. I can't even shift." She said the last words with the familiar, bitter shame that always accompanied them. It was her greatest failing, the source of all her misery. Cale's expression hardened. "Who told you that you were nothing?" She flinched at the anger in his voice, a low growl that vibrated through the bed. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "Everyone," she said quietly. "It's what I am." "No,"
he said, his voice firm, absolute. "It is what you were told you are. It is a lie. The bond does not make mistakes. It chose you, which means you are anything but nothing." He reached out, his fingers gently tilting her chin up until she was forced to look at him. "You are the other half of my soul. You are my queen." Queen. The word was so absurd, so completely disconnected from her reality, that a hysterical bubble of laughter threatened to escape her. She choked it down. He was insane. Or she was. Maybe they both were. Over the next few days, Ilara lived in a state of suspended disbelief. Kale treated her with a reverence that was utterly baffling. He had her moved to a suite of rooms adjoining his own. Rooms filled with soft fabrics, warm fires, and books with beautiful leather bindings. He brought her meals himself, sitting with her in comfortable silence as she ate. He never pushed, never demanded, but his presence was a constant, a steady weight at her side. His people, the warriors and servants of the citadel, regarded her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They saw the mark, which she tried to hide beneath high-collared tunics, and they saw their king's unwavering attention. Whispers followed her wherever she went. The Ash-Hand Omega from the Volkov pack was the Alpha King's fated mate. The news had apparently spread like wildfire. She learned that Kale's warriors had found them in the cave shortly after she had passed out. They had been tracking their king, who had been ambushed by a band of rogue shifters loyal to a shadowy rival. Kale had dispatched them easily, but not before taking the wound in his side. The blizzard had forced him to take shelter. It was fate, he had told her, that had led him to her. But as the days passed, a new, terrifying reality began to set in. Her old life was gone. She could never go back to the Volkov pack. But what was this new life? She was a stranger here, an imposter in a queen's chambers. The self-doubt that had been her lifelong companion gnawed at her. She was worthless. Sooner or later, Kale would see it too. He would realize the bond had made a terrible mistake, and he would cast her aside. The thought was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. Her old pack was not so easily forgotten either. A week after her arrival, a delegation from the Volkov pack arrived at the Citadel, led by Alpha Volkov himself. Lyra was with him, her beautiful face a mask of false concern. They had come, they claimed, to retrieve their lost Omega. Kale received them in the great throne hall. He sat upon a massive throne carved from the heart of a mountain, a crown of polished obsidian resting on his dark hair. He was every inch the king, cold and formidable. Ilara stood just behind his throne, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her body trembling. "She is a member of my pack, Your Majesty," Alpha Volkov said, his voice oily and obsequious. "A simple girl, weak in the head. She wandered into the storm. We are grateful for your hospitality, but it is time for her to return home." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes fixing on Ilara. They were filled with venom. "Yes," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "We have missed our dear Ilara. She belongs with us." She deliberately let her gaze drop to the collar of Ilara's tunic. She knew. Somehow, she knew about the mark. She must have seen it in the cave, or perhaps the rumors had been that specific. Kale's voice was like the cracking of a glacier. "She belongs nowhere but by my side." He stood, descending the steps of the dais. The sheer force of his presence made Alpha Volkov take an involuntary step back. "She is my mate, my bond, and her home," Kale said, stopping before them, his golden eyes blazing. "Is here." He reached out and gently pulled down the collar of Ilara's tunic, exposing the silver and gold mark for all to see. Gasps echoed through the hall. Alpha Volkov's face went pale with shock, but Lyra's expression twisted into one of pure, unadulterated hatred and jealousy. She looked at Ilara as if she were a piece of filth that had somehow stolen a priceless jewel. "You will leave," Kale commanded, his voice a low, deadly growl. and you will never refer to your queen as a simple girl again. If you or any of your pack ever come near her again, I will burn your lands to ash and salt the earth." The threat was delivered with such cold finality that no one doubted he meant it. Alpha Volkov and his entourage practically stumbled over themselves in their haste to leave. But as Lyra passed, her eyes met Alara's one last time. They held a promise of pain. This was not over. The encounter left Alara shaken. Lyra's jealousy was a palpable thing, a poison she could feel even from across the hall. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Lyra would not let this go. She had seen Alara not as a person, but as an obstacle, a worthless stray who had stumbled into a life that should have been hers, and she would do anything to take it away. The days that followed were a strange mix of hope and fear. The hope came from Kale. He was patient, gentle, and fiercely protective. He taught her about the bond, explaining that it connected not just their souls, but their strengths. He told her stories of his long life, of the loneliness that had been his constant companion. With him, for the first time, Alara felt seen. He looked at her and did not see Ashhand. He saw his mate. And slowly, tentatively, she began to believe it. But the fear was always there, a shadow at the edge of her vision. The fear of Lyra's hatred, and the fear of a name she had heard whispered in the Citadel's halls. Lord Malachor. He was the shadowy usurper, leader of a dark faction known as the Ember Covenant, the one who had sent the rogues to ambush Kale. He was a creature of shadow and ambition who sought to overthrow the Alpha King. Her fears proved to be well-founded. One evening, as she was walking in the Citadel's winter garden, a place of stark beauty with snow-covered pines and ice-rimmed fountains, the world went silent. The normal sounds of the fortress, the clang of the forge, the shouts of warriors training, simply ceased. An unnatural quiet fell, heavy and oppressive. Before she could react, shadows detached themselves from the twilight. They were men, clad in black leather armor that seemed to drink the light, their faces hidden by cowls. They moved with a silent, preternatural grace, members of the Ember Covenant. Panic seized her. She turned to run, to scream for Kael, but they were too fast. One of them grabbed her, his hand clamping over her mouth. A cloth was pressed to her face, and a sweet, cloying scent filled her nostrils. Her legs gave out, her consciousness spiraling away into a black void. She woke up in darkness and cold, a deeper cold than she had ever known. It wasn't the natural chill of winter. It was a dead, magic-sucking cold that seemed to leech the life from her. She was in a cell, the floor and walls made of a strange black stone that felt slick and icy to the touch. Heavy chains were bound around her wrists, and the metal was silver. The effect was instantaneous and agonizing. The bond, her vibrant, humming connection to Kael, was muffled, choked. It was like a vital part of her had been severed. The loss was a physical pain, a hollow, aching void in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She could feel a faint, distant echo of him, a frantic pulse of rage and terror that was his and not hers. But it was weak, distorted, as if coming from a great distance. The cell door scraped open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall and unnaturally thin, wrapped in robes the color of dried blood. He stepped into the meager torchlight, and Alara's breath caught in her throat. His face was pale and gaunt, with eyes that were black pits of ambition. This was Lord Malachor. "The king's little stray," he said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that scraped against her nerves. "You have caused a great deal of trouble." He circled her cell like a vulture. "Do you know what you are?" he asked, his empty eyes fixing on her. "You are a key, a dormant vessel of pure life magic, a bloodline we thought had died out, the very thing needed to sever the Alpha King from his power." Ilara stared at him, her mind reeling. Life magic? Her? It made no sense.
Oh, you did not know. Malachor chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement.
Your shiftlessness is not a weakness, my dear. It is a sign of your purity. Your bloodline traded the beast for a far greater power, a power that can heal or destroy. Kale's strength is tied to the heart of this land, a bond of ancient magic, a bond I intend to claim. And you, he said, stopping in front of her, are going to help me break it for him. Despair washed over her, cold and absolute. She was a weapon to be used against Kale. Her greatest fear was coming true. She was going to be the cause of his downfall. She pulled against the silver chains, a useless, frantic gesture. The metal burned her skin and the bond flickered, threatening to go out completely. Kale, she thought, her mind screaming his name into the void. Kale, I'm sorry. The pain of the severed bond was excruciating. It felt as if her soul was being torn in two. Malachor watched her writhe, a cruel smile on his thin lips. He can feel this, you know, he hissed. Every bit of your pain. His power is tied to yours now. As you weaken, so does he. This was his plan, not just to use her as a key, but to torture her, to cripple Kale before the final battle. The realization was a new layer of horror. She was not just a prisoner, she was an instrument of torment. Days blurred into a nightmare of cold, pain, and despair. Malachor would visit her, his whispers of her worthlessness and Kale's inevitable defeat a constant poison. He fed her just enough to keep her alive, a thin, watery gruel that tasted of ash. The vibrant connection to Kale dwindled to a thread, a fragile strand that she clung to with every ounce of her will. In the deepest, darkest moments, when the pain was unbearable and hope had all but died, she would close her eyes and focus on that single thread. She poured all of her remaining strength into it, a silent, desperate plea. And then, one night, she felt something in return. It was not a voice, but a feeling, a surge of pure, undiluted will, a wave of fierce, possessive love that pushed back against the darkness. It was Kale. He had found her. Hold on, the feeling resonated through the bond, a silent promise that shook her to her core. I am coming. The message was a spark in the crushing darkness. It ignited the tiny, stubborn ember of resilience within her, the one that had refused to be extinguished even on the cold flagstones of the Volkov packhouse. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. He was coming. She just had to hold on. The ground began to tremble, faintly at first, then with increasing violence. The sound of a war horn, deep and resonant, echoed from somewhere far above. Shouts and the clash of steel followed. The battle had begun. Malachor stormed into her cell, his face a mask of fury. He's here, he spat, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her to her feet. The silver chains bit into her wrists. No matter. The ritual is ready. You will serve your purpose now. He dragged her from the dungeons, up winding stone stairs, into a vast, cavernous chamber. A twisted, pulsing crystal of black rock stood in the center, emanating waves of dark energy. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and decay. His acolytes, the cowled members of the Ember Covenant, were chanting in a guttural language. Through a high, arched window, she could see the battle raging outside. Kale's warriors, a tide of gray fur and gleaming steel, were crashing against the fortress walls. And at their head, a whirlwind of death and fury, was Kale. He fought like a demigod, his massive form a blur of motion, his greatsword scything through Malachor's forces. Even from this distance she could feel his rage, a palpable force of nature directed entirely at this place, at her captors. "Chain her to the altar!" Malachor shrieked. His followers dragged her to the dark crystal and shackled her to its base. The moment the silver chains touched the crystal, a new kind of agony ripped through her. The dark magic of the stone began to drain her, pulling at the dormant life magic Malachor had spoken of, twisting it, corrupting it. Suddenly, A section of the chamber wall exploded inward in a shower of rock and dust. Kale stood in the breach, his golden eyes blazing with apocalyptic fury. He was covered in blood and grime, his greatsword in hand, a figure of pure, righteous vengeance. His gaze swept the room and landed on her, chained to the altar. The rage in his eyes intensified, becoming a white-hot inferno. "You," he snarled at Malachor, his voice a promise of death. "You are too late, King of the North," Malachor cackled, raising his hands. "The ritual is beginning. Her life force will sever your connection to the land and grant it to me." Shadowy tendrils erupted from the crystal, wrapping around Kale, attempting to hold him, to drain him. He roared, his own power flaring to life, pushing them back. But more came, and Alara could feel his strength beginning to wane. Malachor was right. Her pain, her weakening state, was affecting him. She was killing him. Seeing him falter, seeing the man who had shown her kindness and called her his queen in danger because of her, shattered the last of her fear. It shattered the years of conditioning, the deeply ingrained belief that she was worthless and weak. All that was left was a pure, triumphant rage. "No," she whispered, the word a vow. She looked at Malachor, at the creature who had tortured her, who was trying to kill her mate. She looked at Kale, fighting for her, loving her, and something inside her broke free. The life magic Malachor had wanted to corrupt erupted from her. It was not a trickle. It was a flood. A tidal wave of pure golden light exploded from her body. It was the light of the sun, the warmth of a hearth, the ferocious, protective love of a she-wolf for her mate. The silver chains binding her melted into slag. The dark crystal screamed, a high-pitched, unholy sound, and then shattered into a million pieces. The wave of light washed over the chamber. It incinerated Malachor's acolytes, turning them to ash where they stood. It slammed into the shadowy tendrils holding Kale, dissolving them into mist. It washed over Kale himself, and she felt his strength surge, his wounds knitting closed, his power returning tenfold. Alara stood in the center of the devastation, bathed in her own golden light, her body thrumming with a power she had never known she possessed. She felt whole, powerful, free. Malachor stared at her, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. "Impossible," he breathed. She met his gaze, her eyes glowing with the same golden light that now surrounded her. "They called me Ash Hand," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with newfound power. "They called me nothing. They were wrong." She took a step towards him, the light coalescing around her. "I am not nothing. I am the light that ends you." With a scream of pure rage, Malachor lunged at her, his hands transforming into claws of shadow. She did not flinch. She simply raised her hand, and a beam of concentrated golden energy shot forth, striking him square in the chest. He shrieked as the light consumed him, his form dissolving, his shadows burned away by her purity until nothing was left but a pile of dust on the stone floor. The light receded, coalescing back inside her, leaving her standing in the silent, ruined chamber. The battle outside had fallen quiet. It was over. She swayed on her feet, the sudden expenditure of so much power leaving her drained. Strong arms wrapped around her before she could fall. "Kale." He pulled her against his chest, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. He was shaking. The great, powerful Alpha King was shaking. "Alara." He breathed her name like a prayer. "I thought I'd lost you." She leaned into him, her cheek against the rough fabric of his tunic, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. She was home. "You found me," she whispered. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his golden eyes glowing with a love so profound it stole her breath. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones. "You found yourself," he corrected her, his voice thick with emotion. "My brave, powerful queen." He kissed her then. It was not a kiss of gentle reverence, but one of desperate, soul-deep relief. It was a kiss of promises kept and a future claimed, a sealing of their bond not by magic, but by choice. The mark on her collarbone blazed with heat, a searing, joyful pulse of energy. As she kissed him back, pouring all of her love, her relief, her newfound strength into the embrace, she felt a corresponding heat flare to life against her lips. When they finally broke apart, breathless, she saw it. A new mark had appeared on his skin, over his heart, visible through the tear in his tunic. It was the mirror image of hers, a golden wolf howling at a silver sun. The bond was complete, equal. He took her hand and led her from the ruined fortress, out into the dawn. His warriors, his entire army, were assembled in the courtyard below. They were bloodied and weary, but they stood tall. When they saw him emerge, with her at his side, a cheer went up, a deafening roar of victory and loyalty. Kale led her to the edge of the battlements, so all could see. He raised their joined hands high. "Behold!" his voice boomed, carrying across the entire army. "Lord Malachor is dead! The Ember Covenant is broken! And this is Ilara, my mate, my soul, your queen." He turned to her, his eyes shining with pride. "You are not Ashhand," he said, his voice for her alone. "You are not astray. You are the heart of the North. You are my light." She looked out at the sea of faces turned up to her, at the warriors of the northern clans, their expressions a mixture of awe and dawning respect. She looked at the man beside her, the powerful king who saw not her past, but her soul. He had not patched her life with gold and riches, but with something far more precious, with love, with belief, with a sense of belonging she had never dreamed possible. A true, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in memory. The tiny ember of resilience that had kept her alive through so much pain had finally been allowed to grow into a blazing, beautiful fire. She was home. She was loved. She was queen. And she was just beginning.